Welcome to Beyond at Home. We're so glad that you're here, whether you're joining on Facebook or YouTube. But today, we're actually breaking Beyond at Home history because we've got 3 hosts, not just one. My name's Lockie, this is Zach, and this is Connor. And today, we're your hosts for the online service. We really hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, today we're exploring the myth about suffering. And if you believe it for long enough, it will erode your faith.
But before we get to that, here at Beyond, we're creating a church that unchurched people love to attend. So if you're new here with us or new to this whole Jesus thing, we really think that what we have here for you tonight is going to be really helpful. But if you want to get connected in with Beyond, the easiest way is to either like or subscribe to our Facebook, and you'll get notified as soon as we go live.
Awesome. We'll see you at the end.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us for Beyond at Home. If you're brand new with us here and you're not sure what you believe about God, faith, Jesus, the Bible, then don't click away, because what we're going to talk about today might just help you figure some of that stuff out. And if you are a Jesus follower and this last season of life has caused you to maybe become unsure of your faith or doubt your faith, then what we're going to talk about today is a myth that, if left unaddressed, has the potential to ground your faith into dust. But don't worry, because I'm going to tell you what to do about it. So let's go. To get us thinking about this, I want to introduce you to a really famous author that wrote in the 20th century and some of the words that he wrote. And his name is C.S. Lewis. And if you have no idea who C.S. Lewis is, he's the guy that wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. But in one of his other pieces of writing, C.S. Lewis writes this. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. And it's the thing he says next when referring to pain that I want to spend our time focusing on today. Because this is what he says. He says, it is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And maybe for you, your story, you can relate to the words that C.S. Lewis wrote. Because you were going through life and everything was going well, and you were kind of oblivious to the fact that God existed. And then all of a sudden you got that call, or you got that diagnosis, or that relationship began to break down. And all of a sudden, you found yourself beginning to think about and contemplate a God that existed that up until that point you had never, ever considered before. Maybe for you, your story is not like that. Your story is actually the opposite. That because of your personal pain or because of the suffering that you see in the world, that you look out and you wonder, how could a God exist if he allows this to happen? Or if he does exist, he's not someone that I would want to have a personal relationship with. And here's what I want to explore in the next few moments that we have together. It's this simple question. How can people with similar experiences of pain and loss be led to such different conclusions? To begin to wrestle with this question, I want to introduce us to Admiral Jim Stockdale. Now, Admiral Stockdale was a naval officer in the American Navy, and he was actually the Vice Admiral of the American Navy during the Vietnam War. And what he's perhaps most known for, the fact that he was the highest ranking United States military officer captured as a prisoner of war, and he was held at the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp. What's fascinating to me is he was held there for 8 years. He was tortured over 20 times. Primarily the reason he was tortured because he would not involve himself in the North Vietnamese propaganda machine. In fact, he was so against involving himself in the propaganda machine that it got to a point where he actually disfigured his face so that he would not be able to be shown on TV. And years after he survives this camp, Admiral Stockdale sits down with author Jim Collins, and they have this conversation. And Jim Collins asks a question that I would definitely want to ask Admiral Stockdale, and maybe you would want to ask him as well. And the question is, how did you survive the 8 years as a prisoner of war? How did you survive the torture? And this is his response. He says, I never lost faith in the end of the story. And I could kind of just stop there, but then he kind of goes on a little bit to explain what he means by this. He says, I never doubted, not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life. In retrospect, I would not trade it at all. And then Collins asks this fascinating question. He says, well, who didn't make it out? And Stockdale says this, oh, that's easy. The Optimus. And when I read that, I was kind of like, what do you mean the optimists? Like, I kind of assumed that Admiral Stockdale himself was an optimist, but he says they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, well, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. He said they died of a broken heart. And then he makes a note of telling Jim that what he's about to say next is a lesson that he took away from watching this unfold before his eyes. And it's a lesson we can take away as well. This is what he says. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. This statement is referred to as the Stockdale paradox. Now, a paradox is a statement that on the surface doesn't seem to make sense, but when you dig a little bit deeper, you begin to understand that it actually makes a whole lot of sense. And the paradox that Stockdale is referring to here is that on the one hand, you have to hold on to hope. You have to hold on to the way that you want things to end up in the long run. But on the other hand, you have to hold on to the brutal facts of reality. You cannot allow what's happening in the moment just because you want things to happen one way in the end. You cannot allow that to refuse you to deal with uncomfortable and challenging situations in the moment. So you have to hold on to both at the same time. And the reason that I bring this up is because Christianity, our faith, comes packaged with a similar paradox. Let me explain. As Christians, we have a future hope. But that future hope is tethered to a brutal fact. Now, the problem for so many Jesus followers is that we get so fixated on the future hope that we attempt to pray away, obey away, and faith away the brutal fact. In fact, there are some versions of Christianity that just completely ignore this brutal fact altogether. It's a fact that when life is going well, we tend to forget. But if we forget it when life is going well, it has the potential to cause faithlessness and despair when things get turned upside down. So, here's the first part of the brutal fact. There is a cause and effect relationship between sin and suffering. And you get this on a personal level, right? Because there have been things that you've done in your life that you might consider bad that have affected you relationally. And if you're kind of new to the whole church thing and sin is a word that you're not really sure what it means, you've just seen maybe Jesus followers use it in an abusive way, I want to let you know that sin is not really anything bad. It's more than that. Sin is anything that separates us relationally from others and also separates us from God. And on a relational level, you and I can kind of think of times where we've seen that one-to-one correlation, right? Where you've had some behaviors that have caused distance or separation between you and friends and family, or that there have been certain patterns of addiction in your life, or behavioral patterns that have caused separation or distance between you and co-workers. It's easy for us to understand that there are personal consequences for personal sin. But there's a second part to this brutal fact that is really challenging for us to get our heads and our hearts around. And it's this, that there is a global relationship between sin and suffering. Now, if you look at the second part of this brute fact and you resist it, I get it because I want to resist it as well, because it takes the control away from us. But the fact is, when sin entered the world, it held the door open for death, for sorrow, for illness, and for despair to follow after it. And when you read the New Testament and you begin to explore the life of Jesus, you begin to see so clearly that Jesus acknowledged this brutal fact. And while the message of Jesus is one of hope, it never forgets or never shies away from the fact that sin has entered the world and it will touch the life of every single human being. A few examples might help us kind of wrestle with this. And Jesus' best mate, John, actually describes an event or an example that will help us wrestle this to the ground. I'll just read you what he wrote. He says, as Jesus was walking along, this is with his disciples, he saw a man who has been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin or his parents sinned? See, even Jesus' disciples assumed that there's a personal connection between sin and suffering. So they're kind of asking Jesus, hey, tell us whose sin led to this suffering. See, really what they're assuming is that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to sinners. But Jesus challenges this assumption. He's saying, no, you don't understand the global consequences of sin and suffering. And he says this. He says, it's not because of his sin or his parents' sin, Jesus answered. In other words, he wasn't born blind because of personal sin. He was born blind because of the consequences of sin existing in the world. And then he says this. He says, this happened so the power of God could be seen in him. In other words, because of the fallout of sin, God is actually going to use the consequences of global sin to draw attention to himself. And Jesus kind of carries on. He says, we must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and no one can work. And then he says this, but while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. And Jesus is saying that while I am in the world, I want to demonstrate to you that I have the power and the ability to reverse the consequences of sin. And all throughout Jesus' life, he would bring sight to the blind. He would restore people who were born lame and allow them to be able to walk again. And what Jesus was doing when he did this is he was announcing that someone more powerful than the consequences of sin has arrived. Now, for me, this is just wild to get my mind around. And if you're someone who's new tuning in for the very first time, or you've just kind of started to explore this whole thing called faith and Jesus, I can understand that this can be a really challenging thing for us to begin to wrap our minds around. Thankfully, someone who came years after Jesus and began to plant churches around the Mediterranean Rim, a guy called Paul, teases this out a little bit further in a letter that he wrote to a church. And Paul writes this. He says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man. And in this context, the way Paul refers to sin, he's treating it like an entity. Like it's kind of like energy or information, like you can't put it in a box and see it, but you can definitely feel its effects and you can see the results of it. And he says, and you know what followed on the heels of sin? He says, and death through sin. And in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. So sin opened the floodgate for death and all its cronies to kind of march into the world. And Paul would say, here's something you need to know about that you cannot pray the consequences away, obey the consequences away, or faith it away. In fact, Paul would probably say, much like I'm going to say right now, that anyone who tries to tell you that you can is either trying to sell you something or they haven't read the New Testament. Now, here's something I just want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge that's not fair. But brute facts are never fair. And as much as I want, and perhaps you want, for there to be a one-to-one correlation between sin and suffering in the world and good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people, the reality is if you cling to that myth for too long, your faith and my faith will eventually be ground into dust. See, Jesus followers, we have never believed that God doesn't allow bad things to happen to good people. In fact, as Jesus followers, what we actually believed is the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. That Jesus, the best possible person, was crucified and murdered on a cross. The worst possible thing. Now, here's the thing. Should we resist evil? Yes. Should we fight disease? Yes. Should we alleviate pain and suffering? Yes. Should we stand up and fight against injustices? Absolutely. But will we win in the end? The answer is no. But the good news is that's not the end of the story. There is hope. And it's found in the person who came to address the root problem, sin. And Paul keeps going on. He says, for if by the trespass of one man, death reigned through that one man. He says, here's the good news. How much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace, and grace here is referring to the ability to endure, grace and the gift of his righteousness, which is just simply the fact that our relationship with God is secure. And then he finishes this way, and the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. See, we reign in life by embracing the paradox that sin, it will have its way today. but not forever. We reign in life by devoting our lives not to preserving our lives, but by following the one who offered real life and the ultimate solution to sin. So the authors of the New Testament are clear. Jesus did not offer himself as a solution to sin from the comfort of heaven, but he entered history to suffer alongside you and to suffer alongside me. And here's where this lands for us. We always do this thing here at Beyond. It's called a Full Monday because we just don't want you to tune in and listen. We actually want this to be something that you can engage with, regardless of whether you're a Jesus follower or not. We hope that you'll be able to engage with what we've been talking about today. And so we have this thing called a Full Monday. And this week's Full Monday is simply this: never lose faith in the end of the story. Now, I know that kind of sounds like this pithy Hallmark card, but I assure you, because of the life of Jesus, it is so much more than that. See, because of the life of Jesus, that you can know that God is good, even though your circumstances might not be. And the reason that you can know that God is good and God is trustworthy is because God chose to step into history and suffer alongside you and suffer alongside me, even when he had the right not to. See, the sufferings in our life are really just a reminder of the global consequences of sin and our need for a savior. And they're a reminder that one day God will make all things new. And in this moment, you might be wondering, well, how do I ensure that I never lose faith in the end of the story? Well, I've got a second way for you to engage this week in the form of a second Full Monday. And the second Full Monday is simply this question. It's, if left unaddressed, what has the potential to undermine your faith? What attitude that you have about God, what myth that you believe about the Christian faith, what area of your life or what relationship that's not working, what area or aspect, if left unaddressed, has the potential to undermine your faith? So the first step to doing something about it is recognizing some of the brute facts that exist in our lives. As C.S. Lewis said, suffering is God's megaphone that he uses to rouse a deaf world. The question we have to answer is, will we listen and respond?
G'day team, it's us back again. During this message, someone might have come to your mind that you thought that this message would have been really helpful for. So I'd really encourage you to share that message with them, and you can help them out as well.
Thanks so much for tuning in today, whether it was live or on demand. We're so glad you were able to tune in.
And if you want to find out more content, go further in this message about suffering. We actually host the Beyond the Message podcast, and that's available on Wednesday. And you can catch back any episodes of Beyond at home and look at anything. Zach's excited about it. I am too. So if you want to check that out, please do take that next step. Apart from that, we'll see you this time next week. Have a great one.